Te rangatira, tuare, tēnā ko e hoa. Te whare wānanga o te poti, tēnā ko. Tēnā kōtau te hunga kāinga o ngai tahu, kai tahu, te mana whenua. Tēnā ko. Ngā mihi ki ngā mate, me ngā aitua, a ki te kaihanga i homai tia tonga hea hoki. Nō reira, te rangatira tahu pōtiki, moi mai. Haere atu rā. Nō reira, e ngā wake, ngā mana, me ngā karangatanga maha, koe mā kōra mā raurangatira, o te hui mai nei, tēnā kōtau, rekohu te motu kākano o tā imi moriori, tēnā kōtau, hoko mena tai me rongo. It's my great pleasure today to introduce our keynote speaker to open this conference, the 10th anniversary of the opening of the National Centre of Peace and Conflict Studies. Moana Jackson, tēnā ko i te rangatira Moana. There's a Māori proverb that speaks of humbleness, and it goes like this: Kaore te kumara e kōrero mō tōna ake reka. The kumara doesn't speak of its own sweetness. And for me, that sums up the kind of man that Moana Jackson is. And so, whilst Moana can't speak of his sweetness, that doesn't stop me from doing so. So I'm just going to recount a few of Moana's achievements. So bear with me, Moana. Moana is of Ngāti Kahungunu and Ngāti Porou, iwi. There's a few whanauka here for you, Moana. He was the co-founder of ngā kaiwhakamarama e ngā turi, the Māori Legal Services, in 1987. Moana was also the original author of the Y262 claim to Indigenous flora and fauna that was filed in the Waitangi Tribunal in 1988 and was finally reported on in 2011. That's the first whole-of-government claim that's come before the Waitangi Tribunal, and the government are only now getting around to hopefully doing something about that. So that's been a 30-year process. Moana is a specialist in constitutional and Treaty of Waitangi law and is currently working with other iwi leaders on constitutional reform for Aotearoa New Zealand, and that's with the National Iwi Chairs Forum. Moana is also a speaker and writer of international acclaim. He's the author of I Tangata and a lecturer at Tuanango Raukawa, the author of groundbreaking report on Māori and the criminal justice system, He Whai Pānga Hau. And just over breakfast this morning, Moana was telling me that he's 30 years later, he's doing a review and update of that groundbreaking report, and no doubt Moana will have more to say about that, and what has or hasn't happened in the last intervening 30 years. Moana has worked on the drafting of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. He's been a judge on the International Tribunal of Indigenous Rights in Hawaii in 1993 and again in Canada in 1995. He was also counsel for the Bougainville interim government during the Bougainville peace process. And in 1917, sorry Moana, you're not quite that old. In 2017, he was awarded an honorary doctorate from the Victoria University of Wellington for his outstanding contribution to legal scholarship around treaty and the public debates on how Māori are treated by the justice system and their place in the broader society of New Zealand. So, ka nui te mihi mahana I te rangatira, Moana, nau mai, hara mai, mihi mai.
Kia ora no tātou. Kei te tīmata tēnei kōrero māku kei te tautoko ngā mihi kua mihia. Kia koutou tahu kāinga, ngai tahu, ānei tēnei tētahi mokopuna o ngā te kahungunu me Ngāti Parau, he uri o te waka tākitumu, e mihi atu nei. Kia a koe te rangatira tuari, e mihi mai nei kia hau kia mātou ko tai mai, i runga i te karanga. Kei te tautoko hoki ngā purapura aki o tātou te ni mate ko wehatu kua wheturangitia. I te tino hoa, a tahu, a moe mai i te hoa. Haere i runga te waka moke moke o tō tātou tīpuna, ki o maunga, ki o waka. E kore koe e wareware te hoa. A huri noa a te hunga ora, a tēnā koutou, a mihi mai, a karanga mai. A kia koe māu i te hoa, a mihi mai nei kia hau. Me koe hoki Richard, ngā kai whakahaere o tēnei hui o tātou, a huri noa tēnā koutou. Ko te tūmanako ka pā tātou whakawhiti kōrero, a runga ngā kaupapa i mui a tātou. Nō reira tēnā koutou. Tēnā koutou, a tēnā tātou katoa. I was really pleased and honoured to be asked to come today and to spend some time with you, which I hope will be of some value. It's always nice to come up south, as we say, and to land in the territory of Ngāi Tahu, and we share a waka tradition, of course, which links us to other islands in the Pacific, and I'd like to mihi to our whanaunga from the Pacific, and me koe hoki Oscar, a kanu te mihi atu ki a koe, te tino hoa whawhai, mō ngā moi moia o tō tātou i huri no te moranui a kiwa. I was asked when I arrived if I had a PowerPoint, and I always have to start by apologising because everyone now has really flash PowerPoints. I don't. I'm kind of technologically illiterate, and I keep getting reminded of how illiterate I am. And just a few weeks ago, I was staying with my whānau, and my 10-year-old mokopuna was sitting across the table, and I was working, I thought, really efficiently on my laptop. And she said, "You're not very good on your laptop, are you, koro?" Which I thought was a pretty offensive thing for a 10-year-old to say. And I said, "Oh, it's just a flash typewriter, my baba." And she said, "What's a typewriter?" So that kind of explains it. So I don't have a PowerPoint. What I'd like to do is what I always do. I'd like to tell some stories, and at the end I'd like to try and pull those stories together in a way that I hope might be helpful. The first story I'd like to tell is about a man called Walter Raleigh, who you might have heard of. He's famous or infamous in English history. When Queen Elizabeth I was walking along a street and he allegedly threw his jacket across a puddle so she wouldn't get wet. He's also famous for lots of other reasons, but infamous in Indigenous traditions because he invented the notion of a warrior race. And like all inventions, it began with an untruth, with an attempt to justify what was unjustifiable. But like all inventions in the history of colonisation, it set real events underway. And some of those events which it set underway have resulted in a misunderstanding of Māori history and Māori traditions. When a man called Christopher Columbus was commissioned by the King and Queen of Spain to find India, because there was a burgeoning trade in Europe in the 15th century in spices, most of which were being stolen from India and brought overland to Europe. And it was a very costly and often dangerous exercise. The spice caravans would get waylaid, spice would be stolen, and so on, because it was such a valuable commodity at that time. Christopher Columbus, who among other things was a failed entrepreneur, came up with an idea that if you could sail to India from Europe, it would be cheaper and safer. So he touted his idea around the crown heads of Europe, and no one would fund such a dangerous expedition. There were still people in the 15th century, if you sailed that far, you'd tip off the end of the world because it was flat. But the King and Queen of Spain decided to support him because they were broke. They had just finished a purge of both Jews and Muslims from Spain, and their treasury didn't have much money. So they thought, if we can corner the spice trade, we'll be right. So they sent this man, Christopher Columbus, to find an ocean-going route to India. Well, he never found India. He found islands in the Caribbean. And I've often wondered how he could do that. If this is Europe, India's here, and the Caribbean's here. So I could never figure out how he sailed there and ended up there. So he must have been navigationally challenged or something, because certainly the peoples in the Pacific at that time were sailing across the greatest ocean in the world and not getting lost. And I couldn't understand how he got lost until just recently, 2 or 3 Olympic Games ago, actually, I was watching the rowing. And when our people get into a waka and we want to go that way, then we get into the waka and we paddle like this. Hey. We look to where we are going. In the rowing, I noticed, when Pākehā people get into a waka, they go like this. So they row backwards. So I figured Columbus must have been sailing backwards, and he ended up in the Caribbean. Anyway, he didn't find spice. So when he got back to Europe, he essentially had to make up a story to justify the expense. So he said, I couldn't find spice, but in these islands, which he thought were India, which is why they're called the West Indies, there are treasures of gold. And there's actually a fabled city called El Dorado. And that sparked a gold rush among different European countries, sailing to what they called the New World to find this mythical, non-existent city of gold. One of those people was Walter Raleigh, who got into trouble with Queen Elizabeth after the throwing jacket on the water thing because he was found to be having an affair and betraying the love interest with the Queen. And she was going to behead him. And he said, oh no, if you let me go to the New World, I will find El Dorado and I will bring you back riches of which you have never dreamed. So he sailed. And he couldn't find El Dorado either because it didn't exist. So when he got back, he made up a story, which you can read in his logs, that the reason he couldn't bring gold back was that he found the city of El Dorado, but it was in the territories of people who were born with a lust for blood in their minds and their souls. And I'm quoting directly from his logs. They are, in fact, a warrior race whose only emotion is violence. And from that little lie, centuries ago, developed the idea of a warrior race, which became one of the many reasons used by the colonising states of Europe to dispossess the world's indigenous peoples. They are warrior races, they are savage, they are violent, they need to be dispossessed in order to be civilised. And one of the consequences of that in the history of this country is that the common and repetitive description of Māori people is still of a warrior race. And whether it's the historian Michael King saying in his popular Penguin History of New Zealand that the warrior tradition is what explains the presence of Māori gangs, which is one of the most fatuous historical assumptions I've ever heard, to a book about the extinction of the moa even, that hunting the moa was actually a distraction from the real hunt, which was man for man, blood for blood. And the insidiousness of that fabrication has submerged, among many other things, the long and deep tradition of peacemaking in this country. That no peoples are born with the lust for blood. No people are born as warriors, and Māori are no different. And one of my great friends, a mokopuna of Ngāi Tahu, who's sadly no longer with us at Hapeti Ramsden, would often seek to debunk that myth. And she would say that the moment you label a people as a warrior race, you dismiss their intellectual tradition, you dismiss their poetry, you dismiss who they are as fully human beings. And I've often thought that Alan Duff's famous novel, Once Were Warriors, should more properly be called Once Were Gardeners, Once Were Lovers, Once Were Poets, Once Were Peacemakers. And many of you will know the traditions of parihaka and of rekohu, but every tradition has, every iwi and hapu has those traditions. So in Ngāti Kahungunu, not far from where I grew up, there's an old pā site called Tiro Moana, and it's a pā which was part of the whare wānanga, the higher school of learning, which consisted of a whare Māori where young men and women were sent to learn the arts of peace. Not the arts of war, the arts of peace. How does one rebuild relationships when in the fallibilities and frailties of human interaction, conflict might arise? How does one restore what in Kahungunu we call a state of air, a state of calm in relationships? And the ability to restore those relationships was the base of Māori law, or tikanga, and was the base of the peacemaking tradition in our iwi. And in the whare Māori at Tiro Moana, young people would learn the diplomatic, the philosophical, the intellectual, the very human skills that are needed to maintain peace and to restore peace after conflict. And so if there's one of many things that I hope might come out of this conference, it's a realisation the tradition of peacemaking is deeply embedded in the stories of this land. And that part of the challenge is to reclaim those stories, to debunk Walter Raleigh's story of a warrior race, and to realise that finding peace was as common to Māori society as it has been to any other, and that tradition was disrupted by the most violent and the most unpeaceful process, it's my view, the world has ever known, and that is the process of colonisation, which Christopher Columbus's discovery set in train among the world's indigenous peoples. Because colonisation by its very nature requires the violent subordination of indigenous peoples. It requires a move without justification into the lands of others and the taking over of the lives and power of the people who live there. The great colonial theorist Frantz Fanon once called colonisation a disruption of the peaceability of the human soul. And it has been and continues to be that. And so part of the challenge in this country, I think, part of the treaty journey that the country is on, is to decolonise or rethink what that process of colonisation has meant. And to illustrate that, I'd like to tell a couple of more stories, if I may. As Maui said, the work we are doing at the moment is a revisiting of a report in 1988. And that report was prompted by the government realising that, goodness, most of the men in jail are Māori. Why is that? So they thought they'd do some research, and as colonising governments often do, we're going to do some research on Māori, so we'll get a psychologist from Germany to come and do the research. So she came to do the research. And to her credit, after about a month, she rang me. We'd met at a conference. She said, I can't do this. Can you come with me to the then Justice Department? And would you be willing to do it? And that led to two interesting things happening. Because when the Justice Department asked me how I would do it, I said, thinking off the top of my head, there's a Māori research process, so I will follow a Māori research process. And they said, what's that? I didn't really know. I just knew there was a Māori way of doing things. And I said, well, you need first to go and talk with Māori people. Fairly basic sort of research methodology. And that Māori research process since then has got a name through the work of people such as Linda and Graham Smith and many others of kaupapa Māori research. But in the 1980s, we didn't have a name. And so the research establishment would not accept there was such a thing as a Māori research process. So I, before I could do the research, had to write a report on what is Māori research. Then we spent 3 years on the road talking to our people about why do you think there are so many Māori in prison? And the almost unanimous response was because of colonisation and because of racism, which go together. And that explanation was never offered as an excuse for the harm that some people may have done, the hurt they have caused to others. But it was, if you like, the originating context from which the dreadful figures of Māori incarceration developed. So we produced the report in 1988. And at that time, Māori men made up 52% of the male prison population, and Māori women made up about 6% of the female population. 10 and then 20 years after that report was published, there were national Māori hui to look at what had changed in the intervening years. And apart from a lot of new rhetoric, apart from having bilingual signs in prisons, having carvings in the foyer of courthouses and so on, all of which are good, tangible symbols of a treaty journey, nothing changed. And in 2008, at the 20-year looking back hui, it was decided perhaps we needed to revisit that topic. And the need became greater as we realised that while the number of Māori men in prison had remained at about 52%, the number of Māori women in prison had risen from 6% to 64%. So that Māori women now make up, per capita, the most imprisoned group of women in the world. That is a threat to peace. It threatens the peace of whānau. It threatens the peace of the Māori community. It threatens the peace of this country because it disrupts the soul. And as we began this research, we began to learn that in other countries with a history of colonisation, like Australia, Canada, and the United States, there were similar rates of Indigenous incarceration. And so this research has involved a comparative analysis. And so instead of asking this time, why are there so many Māori in prison, we are asking, why do states with a history of colonisation imprison so many Indigenous peoples? And if you start there, then the research takes you in a quite different place. And one of the places it has taken us to is that colonisation, by its very nature, is not just a peace-destroying process, it is a carceral process. That if you are going to dispossess a people, take their lands, their lives, their power, then you need in some way to control and confine them. That colonisation, by its very nature, becomes a carceral culture, becomes a culture committed to disturbing the peace. And so what we're trying to do in this report is explain the history of the development of colonisation as a disturber of the peace. And again, not to excuse the harm that those in prison may do, but to find a context within which that can be understood and the state of air can be restored. And one of the saddest but necessary parts of the research has been to track the lives of over 700 Māori men and women who have been in prison. And that's the next story I'd like to tell. Because of those 700 Māori men and women, over half as children were taken by the state and placed in state or church care. And you may have seen some of the horrific stories that are now coming out from the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Abuse and Care. And so those children taken as youngsters from their homes, were placed in institutions, and of that half of the 700 who were placed in care, over half were sexually and physically abused. And the worst story, the most disturbing of the peace stories, was told to us by a woman who's now a grandmother, who was taken into care at 8. And when she arrived at the place of care, she was met by 2 other young girls who took her to the flat of the manager of the place of care, who raped her. The next week, when another young girl arrived, this girl went and took her to the flat of the manager because she knew then that she would be safe. She went from care to prison. And after my 2 young women researchers had interviewed her, she sent them a poem which said, "If I cried when I was young, my mother would sing to me. And if I cried really hard, she would pull me close and sing Ko Tero Māori e, and say, 'You are special, my little Māori girl.' When I was 8, my mother died and I was put in care, and no one sang songs anymore. I can think of no greater damage to the peace of the human soul than what happened to those children, mainly Māori and Pacific Island children, but also others who were taken into the so-called care of the state. But just as colonising states imprison Indigenous peoples in similar numbers, so they have similar histories of abusing Indigenous children in care. The stolen generations in Australia, the residential schools in Canada and the United States are part of that same legacy of disturbing the peace of Indigenous children. And so it seems to me, if we are to talk about peace in this country, we have to find a way to reckon with the unpeace of colonisation. And I think this country is beginning to do that. And I think we have a framework in which to do it, which is the Treaty of Waitangi. Because the treaty, for me, envisaged a new sort of relationship between the iwi and hapu who were already here and those who came later. That those others who came later would have a place, but it would not be a colonising place where they would assume the right to take the lands, the lives, and the power of those who are here. Rather, it would be a relationship that sought to maintain the balance of air, the balance of peace between peoples. And colonisation has disrupted that. And so the rebuilding of peace requires what some call decolonisation. And it seems to me that you cannot have peace until that decolonisation occurs. But there are problems with the word decolonisation. And each group of Indigenous peoples has to grapple with the difficulty of that word in their own way. But the word developed out of the freedom movements, mainly in Africa and Asia, after the Second World War, to reclaim their independence from the colonising powers of Europe. And the base of those freedom movements was the right of self-determination, which is defined really clearly in all the human rights conventions, including the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It says all peoples have the right of self-determination. They can determine for themselves their future destiny. And the very notion of being self-determining is that your destiny is determined by yourself, not by someone else, which is what colonisation does. And the United Nations accepted that as the basis of decolonisation. But then the 4 countries which we are actually comparing in our criminal justice system, the 4 countries which actually initially voted against a declaration on the rights of Indigenous peoples, Australia, Canada, the United States and New Zealand, also voted against that definition of decolonisation. And they invented another story, rather like Walter Raleigh's El Dorado story, the warrior race story. They invented a story of what they called blue water colonies. They said all peoples who have been colonised have the right of self-determination unless the country now has a majority population who are not Indigenous. If there are countries where the Indigenous peoples are no longer the majority, then we will call those not colonising countries, but settler states. And the Indigenous peoples in those settler states are not allowed to decolonise. There's a sort of harsh injustice about that false distinction. Because if self-determination is a human right, which is accepted as, a right that inheres in people because they are human, then to say that the Indigenous peoples, say in Canada and New Zealand, are not entitled to self-determination is to perpetuate the unpeace of colonisation by saying those people are not fully human. And so decolonisation then is partly about restoring the full humanity of those peoples. But the treaty offers us a different way to do that. Because the treaty offered a peaceable human relationship. It offered a way that different peoples could share this land. And in many ways, it was a building upon the notion of peaceful relationships, the notion of air that had governed relationships prior to 1840. And so rather than decolonisation, I like to think about this country following what I call a restoration ethic. That is, to restore peace as understood in balanced relationships. That everyone has a place in this land. That there's meant to be interdependence between everyone in this land, but that interdependence has to be built upon the independence of the parties to the treaty. And like I said, I think we're on that journey. I have a pathetic excuse for exercise every day. I go for a walk. And I went for a walk, and everywhere I went, there were bilingual signs around the university, which is really cool. Interesting, though, that the Māori name is always in smaller font than the English name, but nevertheless, a journey that would not have happened 10, 15 years ago. The crunch part in the journey, though, is yet to come. The settlements are another part of the journey, and some iwi, like Ngāi Tahu, have made amazing changes and progress with the benefit of their settlements. But a treaty, not just the Treaty of Waitangi, treaties are not meant to be settled. Treaties have to be honoured. And the Treaty of Waitangi will only be honoured when the imbalance, the unpeaceability of colonisation is settled. So the treaty doesn't need to be settled, colonisation does. And when colonisation is settled, then the treaty is honoured. And the way we do that in this country, I think, is through a process of what I call constitutional transformation, which Maui referred to. That is, how do we recreate in constitutional and political terms the relationships envisaged within the treaty? How do we return to iwi and hapu the right to be self-determining? How do we allow those who have come since 1840 to be self-determining? And how then do we come together to jointly make decisions about the future of this country? That, to me, is not just a treaty journey, it's a peace journey. It's re-establishing relationships where peace is possible. In Māori law, which we call tikanga, which I always call tikanga as law, the aim was always to develop what ought to be in a society. Our people were not unrealistic. We knew that humans are not perfect, will make mistakes, will hurt each other. So perfection was not recognised as a part of being human. Unless you're Ngāti Kahungunu or Ngāti Parau, then we know we were born perfect. But it was a goal to be aimed towards. It was what ought to be. And in that hope of what ought to be is the hope for honouring the treaty, is the hope for peace. And I'd like to close, those who've heard me talk before might know I like talking a lot about my mokopuna. Maui and I spent some time over breakfast this morning in a conversation which was probably boring to everyone else at the table. We talked about our mokopuna. And they teach so much. They give joy, but they give wisdom in their own way as well. And the same mokopuna who told me I wasn't very good on my laptop goes to kura, and she speaks Māori as her first language, which is another part of that restoration of air, restoring what once was. On this particular day, she had some mahi kāinga, she had some homework. And one part of it was a comprehension exercise in Māori. She had to read a story in Māori, then answer questions. And the other part was a vocabulary exercise, where they were given a list of Māori and English words and they had to find the Māori or English equivalents. And she was going through this list of English words. And then she said, oh, what's this word? I don't know what this word is. And I said, spell it, my baba. And so she spelled F-U-T-U-R-E, future. I said, oh, that's future. She said, what's the future? Do you know how hard it is to explain to a 10-year-old what a future is? So I did my best. I said, well, it's when, you know, how the past comes into the present and we live the past and the present. Well, when we bring the past into the present and then we carry it into our tomorrows, then that's the future. And I had no idea whether she thought that was a cool explanation or what. But the next morning, early, I was sitting in the kitchen and she came bustling in, didn't even say morning or anything, went to the cupboard, got out the little lunchbox. She takes the kura, put some food in it, filled up a water bottle, then went outside and started to stuff it in the saddlebag on the side of her little bike. And while she was doing that, her Pākehā mate from next door came through the fence. And he's a couple of years younger than her, and my whānau called him her shadow. He follows her everywhere. Because she's kind of bossy. Sweet bossy, but bossy. And he asked that question that kids always ask, what are you doing? And she gave that really frustrating answer, nothing. And then she got on her bike and started to pedal up the drive. And he said, where are you going? She said, I'm going to find a future. And he said, can I come? And she said, can you keep up? The peace challenge, if you like, the treaty challenge is how we keep up with each other, because Māori are on that journey. And the treaty invites others to come. And there are things we can do to advance that journey. Some are that big sort of constitutional transformation stuff, because in the end we have to change the way this country thinks about what making decisions means. Think about what government means. To place Papatuanuku, to place the earth back as the base upon which government should function. Because the Papatuanuku is not there as the base. If there is no peace with Mother Earth, then there can be no peace at all. So some of it's that sort of big stuff. But there's little stuff that is equally important. And so those little bilingual signs are part of that little stuff, important stuff. And perhaps the Peace Studies Centre can do some of that little stuff as well, to ensure that the original vision, as I understand it, that the centre would be a bicultural or treaty-based place, which would honour all of the peace traditions of this country and would recognise the constitutionality of the relationship, not just in aspirational terms, but in the way it's structured, the way it's staffed, the way it develops its philosophies and understanding of peace. And I would hope that this conference might be part of that journey, so that those original hopes 10 or so years ago of those who established this place may at last come true and be part of that bigger journey that the country is on. So I wish you well in this conference. To those of you Indigenous peoples who, like us, are still struggling for self-determination, to find peace in our own way, in our own lands, I wish you well. And if I can close with just one final statement by another woman who was from here, and her name was Hapiti Murchie. I've often told the story. When we were drafting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, an attempt, as I said, to establish human rights for Indigenous peoples as part of reclaiming the humanity of Indigenous peoples. And I was honoured by being asked to be chair of the Indigenous Caucus. And in my first year as chair, 1992, was 500 years after that Christopher Columbus sailed backwards into the Caribbean. And the Indigenous peoples from the Americas, at our Indigenous Caucus before the working group started, asked if we could have a minute's silence to remember all those who'd been killed and died in the 500 years since Christopher Columbus. And because of the way the United Nations works, I said, I'll have to go and talk to the chair of the government caucus. So I went to see her, and she said, I'll have to ask the governments. And there are about 170 governments, I think, in the United Nations. And she came back about 2 hours later and said, you're not allowed to have your minute's silence. The government say if you want to have a ceremony, you can go outside and have a prayer under the trees. And I had to deliver that response, perhaps that not surprising response, back to the 1,000-odd Indigenous delegates. And their reaction was exactly what I thought it would be. They said, we should just do it anyway. And so it was planned that the next day, if you've seen pictures of the United Nations, most of the assembly rooms are sort of semicircular, and the government sat on one side and Indigenous people sat on the other. And the idea was we'd walk in and sort of fan around the edges of the room and have our minute silence. And if governments wanted to stay, that's fine, but that's what we would do. And then some of those American Indigenous delegations approached us because Hapiti was with us that year, and she was the oldest koe, the oldest woman who was there. And for many of those Indigenous societies, with a tradition of clan mothers, of women in decision-making positions, they asked Hapiti if she would be the clan mother and take us in the next morning, which was a tremendous honour for all of us, Māori who were there, and a special and deserved honour for her. And so we assembled that morning, and we're going to go round the side of the hall, and Hapiti decided that she would walk up the centre aisle and karanga. So she grabbed my hand as she walked in and swept me up the aisle and did this amazing, beautiful, poetic karanga. She called to the trees and the ancestors and the lake and the chairs and the windows. And it was amazing. And then as we paused, and some governments left, the New Zealand government walked out, we noticed the first group that had led us in were the Aztec people from Mexico. And they were in this little huddle, obviously having this deep conversation. And when Hapiti finished the karanga, one of the elders from that group stepped forward, and instead of having a minute's silence, he began this really old and really long Aztec prayer. The next group were, I think, the Mapuche people from Chile. So not to be outdone, they stepped forward and did this really long and really ancient Mapuche prayer. And it went right around the Indigenous delegates. So instead of having a minute's silence, we had a 3-hour karakia. And when it was over, and I was like, God, yeah, well, that was great, hey? And Iri Hapiti said, you take self-determination with you wherever you go. And for me, peace is about all peoples being able to take self-determination wherever they go. Thank you for having me. I do wish you well. Kia ora.
Say a few words, Frank. Thank you.